Thank you very much indeed. Well, I entirely agree with absolutely everything that Jenny has said, but I'll try and make some remarks that will stand as a footnote to what she's been saying. Perhaps the biggest issue that Christians faced in relation to politics at the moment is that we've got this division between liberal globalizers on the one hand and increasing national populism on the other. And a lot of that national populism is sometimes taking a form of something that's near to religious fascism. It's often sort of corralling religion in the service of national identity. And so what I think very, very strongly is that Christians shouldn't be on either the one side or the other, that they need to very much offer precisely what Jenny has talked about, a third way. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that if you think that the churches and religion is on the margins of all this, that might be completely wrong. Increasingly, historians seem to be arguing that, in fact, Christianity went on playing an enormously important political role in the 20th century. And I think the significance of that is that in some ways we do now seem to be seeing a kind of rerun of the 1930s. Nothing's ever, exactly the same. But in the 1930s, you had a standoff between liberalism and fascism. And of course, communism was more of a player. Now it seems to be more, the standoff you're seeing between liberalism and populism seems somewhat to echo the 1930s. Now, during the 1930s, Christians in this country and in France, but Germany, articulated a very powerful alternative, which was often significantly associated with the term Christendom, by which they meant simply that Christianity should be a whole way of life. It should be, if you like, a whole politics. And they tried to offer very much a third way, which was to do with the primacy of association, not the primacy of the isolated individual, not the primacy of the state, not a cult of the nation, but the primacy of the dignity of the person, relations between people, and the way these extend across national boundaries, with national, regional, local identities respected, but looking for much more than that. Now, what historians are increasingly insisting is that the settlements after 1945 were not just secular settlements. In many ways, this was the last set of big Christian settlements, that theologians were massively involved in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, in the formation of what eventually became the European Union, in this country, in the setting up of the welfare state. To some degree, this was actually an Anglican achievement, as is increasingly recognized. So the question for Christians is, you've got this post-war settlement, which in some ways is extraordinarily successful. It produces, at least to a degree, a certain amount of peace. It brings about a welfare state. It brings about a kind of tempered capitalism, if you like, and it recognizes human rights, but it also stresses dignity and relationship. And it seems that over a long period of time, that has totally broken apart. So in some ways, from a Christian point of view, what you need to ask is what we're living through now the result of a complete sort of secular rejection of the last Christian order? But also, are Christians culpable in this? Increasingly, people are saying, that the retreat from the Christendom theme, the increased sort of baptizing of merely liberalism and democracy that you got, especially from the South Bank theologians, for example, in Britain, was not, as they thought, a kind of acceptance.
Do you explain who the South Bank theologians are?
Okay, people like John T. Robertson, honest to God, in the early 60s, people talking about the death of God, people saying that actually secularization is human beings growing up and it's all completely fine. And what people are now saying is that actually it's not true that Britain was secularized at that point. An awful lot of people were still going to church. Church-going was increasing in the 1950s. It's much more as if these theologians helped to bring about part of the 60s in this country. I think Jenny is right. You know, good things happened through the 60s, but we do need to ask whether that started to inaugurate an over-individualism. And so since then, you've had cultural liberalism on the left, economic liberalism on the right. Maybe it's too embarrassing to embrace these two things both at once, but increasingly, I think what we're seeing is that they're converging, but now there's a huge reaction against it. And the trouble is that if you know, there's a sort of populist gut feeling, like with the Gilets jaunes in France, that this kind of metropolitan liberalism, which is marginalizing most people, not just economically, but also culturally, it can't quite be right, and sort of not caring about local identities and you know, the thick traditions of local France. But the trouble is, if you've sort of lost a religious transcendent vision, this tends to take, I think, a very atavistic form. And so for that reason, I think it's very important in this circumstance that the church reasserts boldly that you need a transcendent vision. You need things like believing in the soul, the primacy of relationship. These things really matter. And what can that mean in practice? Well, I think there's a sense in which only religion offers an alternative to nationalism versus internationalism. It gives a sort of thicker sense of a shared international, global identity. I also think churches have a very important role to play, as Archbishop Welby is completely right about this, in creating new forms of embedded economy, new forms of mutualist, associative practice. And finally, I think that the church needs to play a much bigger role in shaping new forms of virtuous leadership. Because although I think we do need more democracy and more participation, I think you can't ever abolish the need for leadership in every level of society. And the trouble is, if you don't train people properly in this, they will always subvert, you know, the democratic system. They will always use it to their own ends. And democracy also needs people to put forward good proposals that we're going to vote on in the first place. So I think the churches have an enormous role to play in trying to train better leadership, better cadres, if you like, you know, not technocratic elites, but truly wise elites.